Great.
Okay, welcome everybody. It's great to have you here for this webinar, and for our first public meeting of the CAP, which stands for.
Community Advisory Panel.
So we have members of the Community Advisory Panel here and online as observers. So without access to microphones, chat but they have access to the chat. We have some people from the general public. I think we have about 35 people joining us today. Yeah, my name is Richard Robertson. I'm facilitating this meeting and helping out the community forest here a bit. And so what I'd like to do is just have a quick look through the agenda. We have 6:30, we're a few minutes late. Apologies for that. We have welcome and introductions. Then we're going to look at an introduction to the Sunshine Coast Community Forest, the role of the CAP and the members, and the responsibilities and the decision making. That's about a quarter of an hour. That takes us to 6:45-ish. I'll try and keep that to time. 7 o'clock, we then switch over to Laurie and Anna, along with Warren, to talk about the subject of this meeting, which is ecosystem-based management and conservation network, and how that's being applied here in the community forest. There'll be question time then from the CAP members and from the public. So thank you everybody who's submitted a question. We'll try and cover all those questions and give some answers. If we don't have time, because we're quite short of time, we'll cover those after the meeting. We'll get back to you, and every question that you put into the chat as well, we'll get a response either during this meeting or following on. Yeah, and then we close up around 10 to 8 and give some closing statements there. So going back to the agenda. Yeah, I'd like to first off acknowledge that we're on the unceded lands of the Shishap and Squamish nations, and we're most grateful to them for us being here and sharing the land with them. And we are going to then look at some introductions. And what we'd like to do is so one of the big purposes of this meeting and having public is so the public get to know people on the Sunshine Coast, get to know a bit better what the function of this group is, the functioning of the community forest. And so I like a 30-second introduction from each of you. I'm not sure if I have the whole list of names here, but I'll do my best. And if each person could just say briefly who they are, give your name, and whether you're a staff member, whether you're a member of the CAP, and your role, and then a key interest in the community forest. So what brings you to the community forests, and what your interests are, so that people get an idea of that. So yeah. Should we just go around the table? Sarah, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'd love to. My name is Sarah Zielman. I'm the Executive Director of the Sunshine Coast Community Forest. I've been with the organization about 5 years.
Thanks.
Laurie Kremsader. I'm an ecologist and doing some work for the community forest in ecosystem-based management and block assessments.
I'm Anna Ewell, and I'm also an ecologist, and I also am doing ecosystem-based management and block assessments.
Warren Hansen. I am the manager managing forester of operations for the Sunshine Coast Community Forest. I started with the community forest in 2021.
Hi, my name is Jordan Wilson. I'm a director with the community forest, and I act as a liaison between the community advisory panel and the board of directors.
Hi, I prepared a few words because I said I was told I had 30 seconds. So I teach applied. My name is Matthew Rockall. I teach applied communication at BCIT, both in business and technical communications. But I started out getting a BA in geography back in the 90s because I was worried about deforestation and desertification, climate change, biodiversity loss, overpopulation, and consumerism. And needless to say, the continued worsening of these trends globally over the last 35 years since have not reduced my fears for the future. So, in the spirit of acting locally, I tried to incorporate sustainability in my teaching practice and to volunteer on the coast in worthy causes. When I saw that the community forest was incorporating EBM into their practices, I was excited and wanted to get involved and do what I could to support the efforts.
Thanks so much. It's great. Bill, would you like to go next? You're next on the list. I haven't.
Yeah, sure. I'll go. My name is Bill Hardy. I'm retired, a long-time Ministry of Forest employee. I've got much experience. I started off digging outhouse holes, and I ended up progressing to managing major engineering projects and going to major forest fires. I've been on the committee for 2 years now, and I've really enjoyed the framework. And my goal for next year is to reach harmony and a framework of maybe a memorandum of understanding with the local environmental groups in the area. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Claudia, could you go next?
Hi there, I'm Claudia Ferris, and I am zooming in from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation in East Vancouver, China Creek watershed. And I was actually on the Community Forest Board from 2007 to 2009 when the Community Forest made a commitment not to log into the Chapman Creek watershed. And so I'm quite proud of that. I was also on the Community Forest Advisory Council back in the day, and I'm back. And my interest is in watershed sustainability, and that's my professional and personal interest. And I'm really excited to see what the Community Forest can do to bring landscape planning for the whole, like on a much wider scale. And that's the bigger picture for me. And I'm really happy to be participating.
That's great. Thanks, Claudia. Who are we going to next? Kathleen?
Hello, my name is Kathleen Sutties, and I'm on the board of directors. I happen to be the chair for the board of directors at this time. And like so many of you, I almost stumbled upon the community forest by accident. I was a beekeeper up in the woods, and that's how I sort of found my way into the community forest. But I have a tremendous amount of inspiration and hope for what the community forest can be in the future and what it can bring collectively to community, to the environment, to all those good things. So I'm super inspired with where we're headed. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. And then we have Steve.
My name is Steve McKenzie. I'm, I guess, one of the newer CAP members. I kind of feel like I'm still in the early stages of learning and all the terminology and stuff. I come from a software engineering background, and my interests are mostly around conservation and sustainable forestry.
Great, thanks, Steve. And I think last on my list here is Wendy. Hey, Wendy.
There, I've just got to unmute myself there. So I'm Wendy Gilbertson, and I am very interested in watching over the years the different things with the forests and with logging and whatnot. And I do have a professional specialization in ecological restoration. And I really support what is being done with the community forest, in that I've seen so much go out of the community and not contributed back into the community over the years. So I fully support it. My other job is I'm your local Sunshine Coast community coroner. One of my hobbies has always been trying to propagate and plant trees. If you look around the town of Gibsons, I worked for them for 36 years, and I used to manage their parks and their forests and whatnot. And arbutus are the hardest things to grow. And if you look in front of the curling rink and in front of the municipal hall and down at Armours Beach, you'll see some that I propagated and grew. So that's about it.
That's great. Thanks, Wendy. I think I'll be coming to you to ask how to propagate some arbutus as well.
Okay.
Great information. Also, thank you for that, and thanks for the introduction. So we get to know each other a little bit. Did I miss anybody?
You got here.
Suzanne just joined us, so she should be. Yeah.
Suzanne, could you? Hi, Suzanne. Thanks for joining. Could you give us a quick introduction to yourself, like 30 seconds, and just mention why you're interested in the community forest? Great, thanks.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Suzanne Singer. I'm the Executive Director of the Sunshine Coast Conservation Association. So I feel like I'm the only person at the CAP table that's kind of like representing a large interest group. On the SCCA, we were actually invited to join the CAP when it was sort of first getting its legs, to make sure that the conservation voice on the Sunshine Coast and the folks that had real concerns about how the community forest was managed previously were at the table. So making sure that we were addressing biodiversity conservation, watershed conservation, and multiple range of environmental issues. And I do want to say it's a really good group. You know, this is a totally different organization than it was 15 years ago when it started. And we're proud to be part of the conversation about, you know, making the paradigm shift in forestry. So thanks for having me.
Great, thanks, Suzanne. We are now looking at some of the aims and format. We spoke to everyone, did we?
Yes.
Good. Yeah. So in terms of the format of this meeting and the discussions we have, the CAP have rules around respect and making sure that everyone can have a voice within the committee. And so one person speaks at a time, and we make sure that everyone can be heard, and we look for ways to make sure that everyone can participate. So yeah, that's the way we move forward. Everyone has something valuable to contribute, and there are no bad questions, no stupid questions. I've got a stupid question. No, those are often some of the best I find, and people come up with some really interesting points and go into some places you wouldn't expect to go. So I think, you know, we have that respect for everyone. There's different levels of knowledge as well. And during this meeting, we're trying as much as possible to keep it very clear and jargon-free. And so if there are any points at which, when people are speaking, someone mentions an acronym or some phrase that you don't understand, maybe just raise your hand as a member of the committee. We'll get some clarification. I'm a forester by background and forest ecologist, worked in conservation a lot, and still there are a lot of terms that I don't get. You probably tell I'm from England as well, so there are some differences in terminology too. So yeah, I'm also learning and here to do that. We are now at around the time we go and hand over to Laurie and Anna to give their presentation. Warren as well. Are you going to give a few words first?
Yeah.
An introduction? Yeah. Oh, sorry, Warren. Yeah. So I've jumped the gun a bit.
You want me to change that?
Yep. No, just see it. Keep it there. Yeah. Hey, thanks a lot for. I'm here to introduce our guest speakers today. But I just kind of wanted to. I've only got 5 minutes, so I'll keep it brief. But we've come a long way since introducing the EBM back in 2021. We brought in Lori and her team with Madrone when she was with Madrone to do a lot of base inventories. But really, the EBM came from the heart. It came from where we were back in early 2021s. Prior to that was the public initiatives, World Cafes, and a 200-page compendium of comments that came from looking at facilitating comments, and really what ABM came from was from the community and the need and wants to be able to recognize biodiversity, recognize recreation, and recognize how our communities use our community forests. Over since 2021, the government has grown. Like we went to EBM and the government of British Columbia has introduced old growth deferrals, regulatory modifications, First Nations reconciliation, and a whole bunch of different things that has significantly influenced our ecosystem-based management. And we continually adapt our management based on these government initiatives. Go ahead. So really what it comes down to is that, we have a commitment from our board and from our CAP to show leadership in our EBM. And our community forest is dedicated to, leading the EBM implementation, and then stewarding our tenure sustainably and respectfully, as well as advancing the interests of our diverse communities. The EBM is a vessel to make sure that those important commitments are followed. The ecosystem also drives our operations, and it starts with that corporate leadership and well-informed policies from our board and CAP, and also as well as elements it provides elements to foster lasting commitments to environmental stewardship and active community engagement, as we have with CAP and various other engagement mechanisms. This all goes down to our operations plans, which isn't being presented today, but in the future we have operations plans that we have annually, and we have and that aligns to our EBM framework. Today's speaker is Lori Kremsetter. And I thought maybe Anna was going to present us too, but she's there for support. But I'll introduce them both. Lori Kremsetter is a respected forester, ecologist, and a wildlife biologist with over 35 years of experience in the environmental resource management. Her expertise covers sustainable forest management, species at risk conservation, landscape planning, and climate change adaptation. Lori has shaped forest management in British Columbia through contributions of the Clayoquot Scientific Panel, Great Bear Rainforest Reserve Designs, and various land use planning efforts. She's committed to bridging science, practice, and she has led research projects, develop monitoring strategies, and training professionals. But I will point out that she most noteworthy was her career was recognized by the Forest Professionals of BC, receiving the Distinguished Professional Foresters or Distinguished Professional Award. Anna Ewell is also a professional biologist, works for McTavish Resource Management Consultants. She has a master's in forest resource management, and she specialized in lighter applications in sustainable forestry, and that's where I met her as a grad student. She helps us with ecosystem-based management, and she does old growth assessments and environmental impact assessments. And in her projects include projects from the Great Bear Rainforest as well. To that point, I have the privilege of listening, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy Anna and Lori's presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, so the community advisory panel asked for a talk about ecosystem-based management, focusing in on the conservation network and some of the stand assessments that we do the community forest. And so that's what we're going to do tonight. So it's a talk to the CAP, but we have also public here. So the talk has to go back and do some basics. I've got 45 minutes because you've got questions and answers and probably some other things you want to do tonight. So I'm going to go really fast. But if you've got questions of clarification, ask them. I can't see anybody's hands on the screen because I'm facing the wrong way. So somebody will have to field those. Yeah, but if there's questions, it'll take me longer. Otherwise, try and get through this.
Yeah, I'll manage the questions, don't worry.
So again, we're going to start with a bit of a refresh. That bit will probably take like 15-20 minutes because we have to do some basics for everybody. And then we're going to get into some of the details about the conservation network. We're not going to touch on some things like zones and retention in the stand level because we just don't have time. So we're going to focus in on conservation network and stand assessments. So back to the refresh. Why do we even think about EBM? People have captured it already in their intros today. EBM for the community forest was to meet these society concerns, right? We don't have much old growth left, especially in the lowlands and the productive sites. We're concerned about loss of biodiversity, especially those things that are associated with older forest. We want our kids to see the same forests and have opportunities to see the same species as we do. And our grandparents did. And we're also concerned about loss of cultural resources for Indigenous people, things like monumental cedar. So we have this thing called EBM, which is supposed to help address some of those concerns, right? It's, some people talk about it like the three-legged stool, this intersection of sustaining ecosystems, still having a working forest, and keeping cultural values. With the sustaining ecosystems being the most important, because without that, in the long term, you lose your economic and cultural values as well. Oops. The community forest developed this kind of cute slide about what they hope EBM does for the community. I'm not going to go through it. You guys can find it online somewhere, right, Sarah? Yeah. So the next thing we need is context is what ecosystems we have, because ecosystem-based management isn't the same everywhere, depends on your ecosystems. We have this great classification system in BC. It's actually the envy of the world, and it classifies ecosystem based on their plants when they're in an old or climax state. And so in the province, we've got like bunch grass and deserts and interior Douglas fir and subboreal spruce, but we're down here in the coast in this blowout section here. We're in the coastal western hemlock zone. That means in an old state, we have western hemlock and cedar. But we're kind of in the drier part, so we're not quite as dry as like the Sandwich Peninsula and Victoria, but we're pretty dry. But we are in the coastal western hemlock zone. So the community forest, which are these three pieces here around Seashell, is in the coastal western hemlock zone, CWH. I will try not to use acronyms. But all coastal western hemlock is not created equal. So we go from very dry western hemlock, which do you see if I point at the screen? Or do I need somebody? Do you see if I point on the
Yes,
screen here?
if you use the
On
pointer
this
on
one?
there, yeah. if you
Okay,
wanna
there we
use-
go.
Yeah.
That's why I'm old. You have to, I'm not tech savvy at all.
I think that's mine.
No, that's probably mine. So we go from drier, this XM extremely dry coastal western hemlock in this lighter green, these edges, Half Moon Bay, the edge of Wilson, to just the dry maritime in this lighter greeny blue color. Up until the wetter, very wet coastal western hemlock, and then the montane, up in the mountains, the VM2 wetter hemlock, and finally into the mountain hemlock, into the high elevations. So these are the major ecosystems of our community forest. Why does that matter? Because ecosystems are affected by and also affect the kinds of disturbances that happen. And the kinds of disturbances help inform how we do ecosystem-based management. If you're in a place in the interior that gets tons of fire, your EBM looks a lot different than if you're on the coast. Return intervals, the disturbance and stand gets is much greater in some other areas. So here in the community forest, we're on the wet west coast, but we're not very wet. We're actually in a dry area. So we're not as dry as parts of Vancouver Island. No, I don't have a mouse at all. But we are relatively dry, and fire is actually fairly frequent here. And so we have stands of old Douglas fir, but they're maintained by fire on the landscape. We also have insects, diseases, wind throw, those kinds of things. We don't expect all our forests to be old naturally, but we do expect like 60–70% of it to be old. More than they'd expect in Victoria, less than they'd expect in the wetter parts of the Great Bear Rainforest. So 60–70% old. What do we actually have out there? So there's a lot of graphs tonight because the CAP needs to know some of these things. And I know it's a pain for a public, and I wouldn't make a public graph presentation full of graphs, but anyways. If we just look at this old bar here in the very edge, you guys hopefully can see this. It says we have 11% old forest left. And it's colored up by the three pieces of the community forest. So the Angus Chapman gray side of things is this yellow bar, orangey yellow. Half Moon is the next one, the darker brown, and Wilson is this lighter brown. But the old forest, it says 11% old forest left. This is of our productive forest land. And it's all in Angus, and it's all at high elevation. So in the low elevation, we don't have any of that expected old left. Ish, tiny bit. Why does that matter? Well, when ecologists think about how much is enough for creatures, we think about these risk curves that say, if you've got, like on the x-axis here, between 100% of an expected habitat out there and 70%. So if you've kept most of your habitat out there, that's pretty low risk for populations that require that habitat. But as you move less than 70%, you get into moderate risk. And then when you hit this 30% level, you're getting into a high risk of populations declining rapidly and going extinct. They don't have enough habitat left. Myself and a couple of others, Karen Price and Rachel Holt, did a paper on this, 2009 thereabouts. Couldn't get it published because the science is pretty soft. Since then, there's been a number more papers. Some of these studies are like taking moss away on rocks for mites that need moss and looking at what the population does. Mowing tall grasslands and seeing how populations change as you decrease their habitat. Or looking at populations of forests surrounded by agriculture, see how their populations change. And so sometimes people say, well, you know, if we think about old forests as our habitat, it's surrounded by other kinds of forest ages, that's a little gentler than most of those studies. So maybe that risk isn't quite at 30%, maybe it's a bit less. That's why we have these uncertainty dashed bars on the graph. But on the other hand, when you do studies, it takes a while for species to react to that loss of habitat. So maybe 30% is a bit like, maybe that risk level is a bit higher than 30%. And also we study species that are relatively common. And maybe uncommon species are more sensitive. But nonetheless, there's been now more studies in Scandinavia, more studies in the tropics. This 30% as high risk is something that's been settled on enough that it has underscored the 30 by 30 that Canada is doing, trying to protect 30% of our ecosystems by 2030. So this risk curve underscores some of our ideas. So right now, we don't have much forest or much old forest in the community forest. We do have existing rules to do something about that. So the community forest lies within two landscape units, Seashell Landscape Unit and the Chapman Landscape Unit. Both of those landscape units have rules about how much to protect. However, they were both given designations of a low biodiversity emphasis option back in the days when those things were decided. And so the legal amounts of protection out there are like 9% in the low elevations. Set aside 9% of old growth or something that will become old, the low elevations, it's about 19% in the upper elevations. And the community forest being just a small part of those landscape units wasn't actually given very much legal requirement at all. So their old forest and the community forest is not even 9%, and their protection level is not even 9%. And so the community forest said, like, we want to do something different, and they started talking to myself and others, and we talked about these risk curves and also talked about what was happening in the Great Bear Rainforest. In the Great Bear Rainforest, they actually aim for low risk, like 70%. But the Great Bear Rainforest goes from the mainland across from Campbell River up to Alaska. And there's 148 or so landscape units there. And what they did is they met half that target, that 70% target, with big protected areas, sometimes whole landscape units protected. And then in the mid-coast, a lot of landscape units with that 50-60% target. But in the south of the Great Bear Rainforest, where they have landscape units similar to the ones that the community forests are in, some in the XM and the DM, they aim for that 30% target as well. And we thought, well, let's try and get to doing the similar things that the landscape units in the GBR are doing. Now in the GBR, community forests don't have to do anything. They don't even have to contribute to the larger landscape targets in the GBR because most of them are too small. There's one in Bella Coola that's massive. They'll probably change the GBR rules to include at least that community forest in the future. So that's kind of it for context. Now we're going to get into the meat of this of today, which is talking about the conservation network and talking about stand level assessments. So conservation networks go by different names. Basically, it's a system of reserves. In the GBR, they call them landscape reserves. The idea of them, the importance of them, is setting aside some forests from like the hand of man, try and keep them relatively natural. Obviously, we have an impact everywhere, so nothing is very natural anymore. But this is a way, if we set some things aside from harvest, it will hopefully accommodate the needs of species we don't know very well. And it'll safeguard against mistakes we inevitably will make on our managed forest. Like, it's pretty arrogant to think we can manage everything and get it right. It's an area where natural disturbances can occur. Here we're a bit limited because we have rules around managing for fire around communities. And they provide a baseline for comparing our management to something natural, right? So we want to learn how our management's doing. We'll have some baselines there to take a look at. And a good reserve system usually has a few core things. It represents the ecosystems out there. So it has the range of ecosystems. It captures important values. I always think about ecology first because, hey, that's what I do. But in this case, community forest case, and in most places, also Indigenous values. And not quite as important, the rest of social values. For the reserve design to be good, we also want like a geographic distribution within our area of interest. Can't all be stuck in one spot. And we want some big patches that aren't affected by microclimate at the edges. So, and we want connections between things. That's what we're aiming for. That's the theory of the thing. But how do we actually do them? And so here's how we actually put reserve systems on the ground. And the first thing we do is to use as building blocks the existing protected areas. So lots of areas usually have legally designated things already. Things like old growth management areas, of which the community forest has a bit. Ungulate winter ranges, they're legally set aside for deer or elk. We don't have any of those. Wildlife habitat areas set aside for murrelet and goshawk typically, or sometimes frogs or things. So community forest doesn't have any of those either. You put parks within your tenure in the conservation network. We have a few slivers of parks, but it's probably just line work errors at the edges of your tenure. For the community forest, we also put all the mapped old forests in because you made a commitment not to harvest old forests. So that went into the conservation network. And then you check, hey, do we got our 30% yet? Well, no, we've got like 5%, right? So we have to do more, which is good. So what else do we think about when we want to make a reserve system? Like I've talked about these things, we want representation, we want values, we want to think about design, want to think about social values. So how do we do these in the areas that aren't legal? So in these non-hard, these non-legal reserves, what do we have to think about? Well, these are the kinds of values we think about. Riparian systems. Yeah, some of them have legal buffers at the edges, but in the conservation network, we're making them bigger. So if the riparian systems are going into the conservation network, they're getting wider buffers than legal. We want to capture habitats for endangered species and ecological communities. So we want to capture those, we call them red and blue, endangered and vulnerable ecosystems that are of an age or of a structure that is actually listed. So plant communities, if they're in their younger cereal ages, they're not at risk here. But once they get into their older cereal stages, then they become at risk if they have sufficient structure. So we want to capture those. We also want to do something for regionally important species like deer and elk. We have models of deer and elk winter range. So we're trying to capture those winter ranges. We also want to capture areas that will become old forest quickest. These areas that have complex structures, which we measure with the thing called a forest attribute score, which we've talked about 3 times so far. And we'll talk about again. And then we want areas that provide connections. Sometimes we find just cool stand things. We don't know what to call them, but they're neat places. So those will go in. And then there's areas that are important for recreation and areas that are important for First Nations. So all these things to weigh to what goes in, these sort of optional things. We want to capture as much as we can within our 30%-ish. Is there something important that you guys are pointing at, or should I just like make you pay attention?
Steve is just asking if you could talk about the difference between old forest versus old growth, if this is an appropriate time to,
Maybe at the end, I think, hey,
maybe at the end.
is that okay,
Okay.
Steve? That could be a good ramble.
It's not. You like
Um,
ramble.
So one of those values, I'll just go back a slide, oops. One of these values that we look at is these forests with structures that are getting towards old growth. And so we have areas that are mapped as old forest, and some of those are or aren't very old. And also the mapping misses a lot of old forest. So when we do field assessments, we keep our eye open for old forest. Community Forest made a commitment not to log it, so important to go out and identify it. And so we use this forest attribute score, which, excuse me, was developed in the GBR for the XM for the dry maritime and the very dry maritime. So very similar ecosystem to ours. And what it does is it looks at 6 attributes: big trees, veteran trees we call them, canopy closure, snags, downwood on the ground, the understory plants, and how, if it was harvested or naturally disturbed. And it scores those things and makes a score that we then can take a look at. And the score for being old forest is you have to be above a 6. And so if we go out there and we put plots in sort of the areas that'll pass, if we can, and it becomes more than a 6, then that's old forest. And that's okay. The map didn't show it as old forest, but it is old forest. That either if it's big enough goes into the community forest, if it's just a plot or two, that might become stand level retention. We also use this forest attribute score to assess whether a plant community is at risk. And there's a land management handbook about that, about how to score ecosystems until when they are sufficiently established to be considered at risk. Okay, so they're not at risk when they're young and simple, but as they get more complex and older, they can cross that threshold into ecosystems at risk. And so that forest attribute score, it helps us find old forest and sufficiently established plant communities, but it also shows us kind of the average structural score in the community forest area. And then we can say, hey, like, if those scores are like better than average, those become interesting spots for us. And we can take those ones that are better than average and look at those along with all these other values that we have to juggle and decide which ones go into the conservation network or not. So not all above average forest attribute scores will go into the conservation network. Sometimes we have very low ones, which also overlap like a species at risk habitat or a riparian zone. So it's just one of these many things that we have to juggle into our decisions. So this is what the conservation network looks like in Half Moon Bay right now. None of these are set in stone, but you can see that up here we have conservation network around Fair Lake or Wormy Lake. We got conservation around Crouston Lake and up into murrelet habitat up here, some winter ranges. Conservation along Wakefield Creek and some of its tributaries. A connection through the middle up to kind of complicated forest, more complex forest up in here. That's what it looks like at the moment. And in a very broad look, at the moment in Half Moon Bay, we've got 31% of that very dry coastal western hemlock, and also 31% of the dry maritime. So in total, we've got 31% of the Half Moon Bay in our conservation network. So the community forest is not only trying to get 30% over its whole tenure, but it's trying to get 30% of each major biogeoclimatic variance. So the dry maritime, the very dry maritime, the wet, the mountain hemlock, they're all treated separately. So what happens in one, like the high mountain hemlock, doesn't affect what happens here. It's 30% we're aiming for of each of these broad ecosystem types. And so we've got that here. So if we find new areas that are interesting, we have to find some areas to take away. Or we can add them as stand level retention, and those don't count to the conservation network. So we can up our conservation that way. Here's what it looks like in Wilson Creek, our conservation network. We've got some areas of very high forest attribute scores. We've used the Hudson Creek, Wilson Creek, and East Wilson Creek as major anchors to build off of and try and build big areas around. Oh, I'm sure there was something else I was going to say on that slide. I can't remember. Oh, we had a really interesting trip out there in, is that November or December?
October.
October? Oh, well, time flies. So we did a block assessment in October and went to one area that we thought, oh yeah, that's pretty simple stand, that's fine to harvest. And then we walked into this other area in yellow up here that had very high forest attribute scores. The vegetation resource inventory didn't call it old growth, but in the field, there was lots of old forest plots. When we came back from that, we said, oh, I don't think you should have harvested there. And so we added that to the conservation network. And we took away, just a map base, we took away some young forest that we had as a connection through this spot. But it turns out that the area we took away, so the distribution of the area we took away was in the XM, not the DM. So all of a sudden now we're below our 30% target in the XM and we're above our target in the DM. So we might have to rethink where we traded there. But
Can you explain that XM and DM again?
so the XM being the dry, we took out that connection, it was younger forest. We thought, oh, that's a good place to take out, kind of gets rid of our connection, but at least it's young. But it's in the xeric, the very dry coastal western hemlock, whereas the area we added is just in the dry western hemlock. They're not super different here, but they are a little bit different. So, and we're trying to philosophically at least get 30% of each of those big buckets. And here's what our conservation looks like in a big piece of Angus Gray Chapman. Now, most of our work here has been done at the low elevation. We haven't walked into the VM2, like the montane slopes or the high mountain hemlock. We haven't physically gone there. So that's just been a map database exercise up there. We have in Angus Gray Chapman, we've got the whole of Chapman watershed that the community forest isn't going into. We've got areas around the Heritage Grove, I think it's called, and around Porpoise Bay. We've got some around the creeks, and there's some winter ranges for elk in here. So we've been, we haven't, obviously it's a large area over there. We haven't been to all of it, but that's what our conservation network looks like there for now. This whole large area up here in the mountain hemlock, a lot of that is not even considered forest management land base. Like it's not productive enough to grow trees very tall very quickly. And so it's in our conservation network, but we don't count it towards our 30% target for the mountain hemlock because it's not really productive forest. It's just extra. So it doesn't go into our calculations about how much we've got of good forest. It doesn't affect how much we protect in the other ecosystems. Like we only want 30%. We want 30% of the mountain hemlock, we've got more. But it doesn't mean we get less of the DM or the XM we get 30% of each of those buckets. And because we have more in Angus Chapman Gray here, which we expect is big, 30% of this is a bigger number. But adding extra here in the mountain hemlock doesn't mean we get to take any less in Wilson or in Halfmoon. We're still aiming for 30% of those ecosystems, those broad ecosystems in each of those areas. And that's what the distribution of so this is the conservation network areas in the brighter orange. Should have said this like 5 slides ago. The stuff that would be in managed forest is in the darker bars there. We're trying to aim for 30%. You can see that we have 68% of the drier bits in Angus Gray. There's not much of it. And it's in areas with high values. So we have more of that than 30%. We've got 68% of it. So not too much managed forest in the drier stuff in Angus. We've got 31% of the DM, the dry maritime in Angus. And we've got quite a lot of the very wet maritime. There's not very much of it though in Angus. And we haven't gone into the VM2 in the mountain hemlock, like the sub-montane and the montane areas. Because we haven't been, their harvest isn't happening there very quick. So we figure we've got some time to make sure that we get the productive forest numbers up a little bit in those areas.
On that, so how long is this process of you assessing and establishing. And
How long have you been working on it?
4 years.
Oh, really?
Three
I
or
would say
4
2,
years.
but that's my usual.
Well, I think in 2021,
2021, beginning of
Yeah.
2021, the
So yes.
terrestrial ecosystem mapping exercise started and then.
Oh, started
and
checking
then
some
and then
things,
that's
yeah.
the building blocks occurred, and then that's when
Yeah.
the whole discussion.
But it's been slow, like this isn't a full-time job for any of us, like the community forest asked us to go do some things and we go do some things. Like it's, yeah. It's
So
been
you
a while, but it's
you-
not continuous work.
But you prioritize some areas that are potential for getting harvested.
So exactly, the low elevations are the most important. It's where we don't have very much old forest and it's where harvesting is happening. So that's our field work has been targeted at the areas that give us the most bang for the buck at the moment. So we looked at the sort of the 3 pieces, the Half Moon Bay, Wilson Creek, and then Angus Gray Chapman. But when you look at the conservation network overall, we need to check some things. And one of the things we check is like, how's our serial distribution? What are the forest ages in our conservation network? And these are the ages of what we've got in the conservation network. We've got mostly old. Well, we've got the old that's there. We've got a fair amount of mature forest. That's great. This mid-serial, Angus has a lot of mid-serial stands. At least the BRI says they're mid-serial. We've got quite a few of those, and I'll show you a graph of what that looks like. Oops, it's easy, but not yet. And we don't have much early, so that's good. We don't want much early in our conservation network unless it's in really important places. But we do. Here's an example. Again, it's in the Angus Gray Chapman area of the community forest. The old forest is in that darker blue here, up here. So this is just a blow up. It's not all the upper elevations, so the lower spots of Angus Gray Chapman area. And the mature is this brighter turquoise. I don't know what to call that. I used to almost be an artist, but I don't know what to call that.
Green.
And then the mid-serial is green. So that the mid-serial is 40 to 80 years old in this particular classification. And we called early serial 0 to 40. But you can see that we use mid-serial and early serial to make connections, but sometimes it's on a riparian or elk winter range. Sometimes we have some of those earlier areas in our conservation network. When we go out and find some interesting old forest or mature forest, we look at those earlier serial stages and see, we don't need all of those. But sometimes it's not, you can't put a whole ton of reliance on the age class map, because the vegetation resource inventory, the BRI, that we use to create the maps and to create these numbers doesn't always match what we find in the field. So one thing is it's always being updated. So every year they take out what's harvested and they age the forest. And it's usually a couple of years out of date. Well, that's not a big deal. And sometimes the line work's not great. So you go out into a forest and you'll say the vegetation resource inventory says this is 56 years old and this is old, like 300 years old. And you'll go through the 56-year-old stuff and think, oh yeah, that's about right. And then, oh, but hang on, it still says it's 56 and we're now pouring trees that are 300 years old. So sometimes the lines aren't very good to mark the edges of the BRI. And we've had the opposite too, where the BRI will say this is age class 8. Another layer from the government will say, no, it was harvested like 60 years ago. And we'll go out and see which one is more accurate. We're not doing enough coring of trees to actually correct it. It's not really our job, right? We're going to check if something's old forest. We're going to check if they're sufficiently established ecosystems, but we're not actually redoing the whole inventory. That would be a full-time job. We also see some like straight up errors in BRI. So we've gone out to fairly skookum areas where the BRI said it's 70 years old. And yet every tree that we've cored in the main canopy is like 150 plus. So there's some errors there. So these maps and all our summary stats you have to take with a bit of grain of salt, right? So we might go out to that early serial and say, oh, we can take that and go and look at it and go, what do you mean this is early serial? You know, this is just a mistake.
Laura, how many slides have you got to go?
How much time do I have?
No. 5 minutes to allow for 20 minutes of questions.
You only told me you wanted 15 minutes to 20 questions.
We can do, we'll take 15. Just letting you know.
Yeah. We're Yeah. The other thing we do, so we check our ages, our serial ages. And then for the conservation network, we check what ecosystems we have. And that's based on this terrestrial ecosystem mapping. Map layers that show what ecosystems are out there. The terrestrial ecosystem mapping at Seashell has some flaws. So it wasn't field verified. It doesn't have structural stage to tell you how complicated the forest is. There's nothing on soils, which affects ecosystems. So it's kind of, it also has, as all ecosystem mapping does, it has proportions, like this polygon is 60% the mesic run-of-the-mill ecosystem and 40% richer swordfish sites. It doesn't tell you where they are. So they're in there somewhere. So the terrestrial ecosystem mapping's a bit hard to use. But nonetheless, we do look at it. We know in the community forest, we've got lots of this middle of the road ecosystem, the 01, that's sort of Douglas fir. We've got drier sites, the 02 to 04 ecosystems, and richer sites, sword fern, salmonberry, devil's club, that kind of stuff. And a bunch of other ones, floodplains, wetlands. And we want to see, does our conservation network hit all these ecosystems? We built it on values. Let's make sure we actually have all the ecosystems too. And what we found so far is that we overrepresent these richer sites. Our conservation network has, now like here we are, the richer sites are these sword fern, salmonberry sites. We have more than 30% of those. And we've got less of the drier sites, the 02, that's like lodgepole pine and lichen. Exactly 30% of the 03, not as much of the middle of the road ecosystem. That one, and it might be true, like we'll have to keep our eyes open for that, but it's a matter of what would we switch? I'm kind of happy we've got more of the richer sites than the zonal site. But then also the mapping isn't great. So we do want to field verify what we have. Because that terrestrial ecosystem mapping is so bad on the Sunshine Coast, the Seashell in their forest landscape plan have decided to go with slope classes. Check how your conservation network is doing on slope classes. And so we look at our slope classes, red being steeper here. Gotta go quicker. And we find that we have on the gentler slopes, like the 0 to 20 and 20 to 40, we have about the same proportion, a bit better, of flat stuff compared to what's outside the conservation network. And less of the steeper stuff than outside, just barely though. And this is just it's a fairly recent calculation for us. We want to find out the slope classes that they're going to use in the forest landscape plan and redo that and do it using the forest management land base instead of the whole thing. And that brings us to my 5 minutes on stand level assessments. Because our conservation network's not set in stone. And when we go out and look at the blocks, it affects our conservation network. So what does the community forest ask us to do in these block reviews? First of all, they have to ask us. We don't go out and do these things on our own. They say, hey, we've got this area we're interested in. Would you please go out and take a look? The first thing is an office review. So we get all these layers together, that vegetation resource inventory, critical habitat mapping for federal species at risk, painted turtles, marble murrelets, the provincial mapping for marble murrelets, sensitive ecosystem inventory, the ecosystem mapping I talked about, that 10. We also look at layers that say what's been harvested. It's called results. We look at watercourse mapping, and there's a few layers of those. And then we look at like an iMap and iNaturalist for locations of where people have found different critters. We do all that in the office, and then we head to the field. And when we get to the field, what we're looking for, like the most important thing is if we can find old forest, we're not harvesting old forest. So that's our most important thing. If we find ecosystems at risk, they're in that sufficiently established state, that's our important thing. The rest are sort of incidental observations. So we try and cover the whole block. We're looking for interesting stand features that might be good anchors for retention, looking for wildlife sign that like nest sites that might be good anchors for retention, interesting characteristics in wetlands, those kinds of things. So we go out and do that, and we feed back to the community forest a report and a map that says, here's where we found some cool stuff. We found veteran overstory trees, like big trees up there. We found a cedar with a triple top that might be interesting to keep somewhere. We found wet areas with water running through them. And so we bring that back to the community forest, talk about it, and they revise their harvest plans. In this area, we revised our conservation network to go through some wetland areas into Crowson Lake to build a better corridor than we had before. We bumped out, or they bumped out based on our, and another biologist that looked at painted turtle habitat, widened the riparian buffer going into the beaver pond there. And in the stand, they kept a big patch of retention. We had it initially as conservation network, but we moved our conservation network up here, but they kept the most important stuff in this big retention patch. And so they will often send us this revised harvest plan for our comment. But we're not, they make decisions on it, and we tell them what we think about that. Here's an example on my left of a stand that was sort of open for harvest in our opinion, and an area on the right there with bigger trees and more understory that had a higher forest attribute score, and that became a retention patch. So sometimes our block assessments say, here, make this retention patch, change these boundaries, we'll make some alterations. Sometimes our block assessments, like the one we did in the Wilson Creek area, is like, yeah, don't go there, right? So it's not very often that we go to a block and say, yeah, you're free to do anything. Even in the simple block, we usually find something that's a really good retention patch. And the great thing is that the retention patches don't count to the conservation network, so we get extra protection. So I'm hoping the retention patches will add to that 30% minimum and maybe bring it up to 40%. We also make some comments in our block assessments about what the cereal pattern is around that block. So how much young forest, in blue here, how much young forest is right there, right? And if you harvest, are you making that young forest patch really big? And we know it's difficult for the community forest to avoid being next door to young patches because it's not a very big tenure. But nonetheless, we talk about them. So those stand level assessments, they're ongoing. We did one in the fall there. We hadn't done one for quite a long time before then. We just do them at request. When we do them, we try and look at the block, but also at the conservation network around the block, seeing like what's better. Is there things we can trade, trying to get a better idea of what's the conservation network, because we haven't gone everywhere. 3 more slides, Richard, don't freak out.
All good.
The conservation network just doesn't stand on its own, right? So we've only talked about the conservation network and stand assessments, but there's other stuff, right? So the community forest has dropped its cut level to accommodate the conservation network. But the landscape pattern of that cut affects biodiversity, and how much you retain in the blocks that you cut will affect how soft that matrix is around what we reserve. So that kind of forest influence will hopefully improve that for biodiversity. And if you can up the stand level retention, even though it's in small stepping stones, that'll add to that 30%. And so for us now, the next steps are putting that conservation network out there to Shishel, to others, think about trading, because they're kind of at the targets that were agreed, and figuring out, if we don't have the best areas in, can we trade them for better areas? What do we see in those block assessments? How do we make them better? And I think also hopefully a next step pretty soon will be trying to align our work with the forest landscape plan. I know they know about our conservation effort and trying to weave into that with their ideas. I think that's it for me. Except to say that, like Anna did 99% of the work on this presentation, and I need a slide like this, and she makes a slide like this. So after I retire, like next year, there'll be a girl up here.
You're not retiring next year.
Absolutely.
No.
Hey,
I'm looking after old parents, like
I'll bribe her with brownies to come talk.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Lori and Anna also, they do our bird surveys as well. So raptor surveys, they've been going on. We're trying to find the screech owl, haven't found them yet. So they do bird calling, goshawks and whatnot, so, So they're adding to the inventories that we already have and supplementing those.
Right. I've seen bards out, but yeah, they're a problem, right?
A bit of a problem.
Yeah. For sure. Okay, well, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. And I'm sure
And I hope that I caught quite a few of the questions that were asked were already in the presentation, so I think we covered all some of those questions at least.
so you're talking about the questions that we got from the
Yeah.
public.
Yeah,
Who
about
are
the
listening?
30% and about like the amount in Chapman, and not sure which other ones we covered off there. But
Okay, so we're going to go to questions from the CAP now, and we'll also they've seen questions that have been sent in by the public as well. So we're going to try and cover some of those. If you feel that your question hasn't been covered or you have extra questions, then you can actually use the Q&A section if you're not a member of the CAP and you're listening in, and I'll have a look out for those as well. So
Bill raised his hand there.
Bill has his hand up.
Yeah, but Steve's question was first about the difference between old growth and or old growth and old forest.
Okay, so Steve, you put a question in our chat. Was that covered by Laurie? Oh,
Basically, so she basically said that the FAST scores basically define what is an old forest, whereas old growth is defined as 250 years plus on the coast.
And yeah, and that's kind of an inventory question definition. The 250 years, right, is a simplified way to measure old forest. And the forest attribute score measures structure, but like we have the forests here have gone through probably several rotations of fire and then growing up and being disturbed, and they're often multi-age, right? They've just got lots of different structures. Yeah.
One of the benefits of a refined terrestrial ecosystem mapping at a much smaller scale is the concept of structural stage. And what that does is they have a wording in there about 250, but the intent of structural stage is, does it look like it's complex enough that it would represent an old forest that would meet that 250 threshold, even if it's not cored to that age? So that's the other one to it as well. Complicated.
Thanks, Anna. And Anna, the owl will pick up your.
Well,
So you can talk to the owl.
well, I'm talking
We
about
have. Thanks.
No.
So yeah, you should be able to see us on there as well somewhere. Anyway,
Back
we'll
of
go.
my head.
Thanks for that. Is that good clarification there, Steve?
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Thanks. So we'll go over to Bill. Fire away, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Lori, for that excellent presentation. So it was the engineering officer for an adjacent forest district, and people used to ask me, it's already been logged once, why do you need to build new roads? Why don't you use the existing infrastructure? So the second part is, when you have the reserve zones, it seems that you need extra road construction to log these, to do the logging. Is that a significant environmental impact that needs to be addressed?
So let me preface this with, I'm not a road engineer. But so roads have a pretty large negative effect on biodiversity. Access for poachers, introduction of weeds, a whole like there's just, you could talk all day on that. But in the community forest, we also know there's a high recreation component. So lots of roads are open for recreation. The places where we've put our reserve network, I think are pretty well roaded already. I don't actually think there's going to be much more road needed because of our reserve network. I could be wrong, but I would be a bit surprised.
Yeah, I mean, Lori's looking at me. Roads for us is kind of like we're looking at more rehabilitation of roads and putting it back. We recognize the density of roads are quite high in our community forest, just based on the just the historic context of a tenure that we inherited. So we rehabbed quite a bit, like almost a kilometer last year. So we're trying to do things in a way to sort of mitigate those high densities. So we're trying to look at in-block roads for opportunities to rehabilitate and then keep the main infrastructure in place. Branch roads, main lines in place, yeah.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the question, Bill, and thanks. Is that good clarification for you, Bill, on that one?
No, no, that's great. It sounds like, but roads are the biggest problem in the forest right now, and it needs attention.
In terms of needing the network and it being,
Probably-
or in terms of their the impact on
Probably
conservation.
being less, right? So it's not just conservation, it's also like water and water flow. So rehabilitating roads, if you can do it, if you can like educate the public so they're not too up in arms when you take away their roads, that's awesome, if you can.
Yeah. Okay, great. We have some more questions.
I have a,
Yes.
so one of the questions that came in from the public was science-based decisions on areas to be logged, given the need to share these lands for recreation, biodiversity, watershed protection, and flood mitigation due to climate change. And I think the climate change question in particular is an area of interest that I'm concerned about, since it appears to be accelerating. What is your comment about kind of adaptation of the community forest to the likely impact of climate change over the next 10 to 50 years? 2 seconds, or in 2 minutes.
So first of all, we're lucky we're on the coast, not the interior, where climate change is being felt even faster.
Yeah.
On the coast, I would say cedar trees are already having some difficulty, summer drought. So maintaining cedar trees that you've got and starting new ones might be a bit of a trick for them. So that's something. Our conservation network is intended to have connections both geographically and up and down slope to help facilitate the movement of things that are slow to move, which includes tree seed, but also insects and crawling and bird, different things that are slow, lichens, some of the mosses. And hopefully they will provide corridors for slow movement in response to climate change, and the stepping stones, the stand retention will help that. But other than, well, I guess can I have another 30 seconds?
Sure. Yeah.
The concern of fires around communities, I totally understand the fear around communities and fire. It also makes me super nervous to have the province saying that you have to manage for fire within a kilometer or 2 of a community, which is a good swack of your community forest. Because I'm just not so sure we know how to do that effectively. I'm not so sure that thinning and spacing and all that is going to do a great job. Maybe in some areas we need to do that, but I'm not sure about everywhere. So there's a longer answer to that, but climate change is something that conservation networks are intended to help by leaving those connections up and down and across.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, corridors super important, and I think this is obviously going to be an ongoing interest and conversation for the group. We do have another question. Claudia, you have your hand up. I think you're next.
Yes, I got a question in about the Wakefield Creek block in the Wakefield Creek watershed. And I guess there was some concern about a wet zone above. I believe the cut block is HM 64. And I guess I'm just wondering what was the process of assessing that through the EBM, and what kind of watershed assessment happens during the EBM process when you laid out that block. I don't know if you can speak to that directly, but maybe Warren can, if you can't, Lori. Thanks so much.
Yeah, Warren can talk to the watershed assessment part, as I'm not aware of what happened there. But for us, we went out to that block when it was first designed. It was like a 16-hectare block, and we went through to look at if anything was old forest and had to not be logged, if anything was sufficiently established and had to not be logged. And we didn't find those areas. We did find a couple of veteran overstory trees that I think are now retention areas. It's close to painted turtle habitat, so we had a biologist with that expertise say that there should be a 10-meter buffer on the creek, and we turned that into a 30 to 40-meter buffer just to be on the safe side. So that's not the block. That's 66. They're actually about 64. And so we buffered out, or at least we indicated the block boundary should move away from some of the wetlands. We have a corridor now going from Crowson Lake up slope through some of those wetlands. I'm not sure what else to say there.
That's really helpful because that puts it in the context of the whole landscape. So thank you. But I guess I would ask Warren.
Anna might have something to add there too.
I also just want to add that the 10 meters was not actually like the 10 meters for unpainted turtle is the regulatory standard if you meet sufficient criteria for it. The 30 meters is an extra of that to help facilitate kind of making, you know, maintaining a functioning riparian corridor. I'd say that overall, especially in Wilson, those like wetter, richer, those wetter, richer skunk cabbage sites are quite, we don't see them often. I think this is the first time we saw it. So it's, you know, just identifying that and kind of noting where the boundary should maybe be altered to help maintain those.
And you know, so Anna and Lori informed us on, you know, development of sort of these anchors. And so we were looking at, there's also a fore and aft trail that was in there as well that we were looking at preserving as a historical feature. We discussed that with the nation as well, and they concluded that, you know, for sure that's something that needs to be protected. We also have a recreation trail that we got trail groups out to have a look at it and discuss what options that we wanted to do in and around that area. And for the most part, we put buffers and trying to protect the trails as much as we can. We also looked at trying to address, there's also a fair amount of root rot, which makes leaving trees like blow down and whatnot to try to facilitate that. But in the landscape context, Claudia, we were looking at initiated a watershed hydrological watershed assessment. And that looked at not just that block, but all the other proposed blocks that we had planned in the next 5 to 10 years to make sure that the impacts to downstream impacts were that we wouldn't exacerbate any downstream impacts, which is like flows through the community of West Seashell, and Wakefield Creek empties out to down there by Wakefield Creek, Wakefield Road, and out through there. So we just want to make sure that, you know, highway crossings and stream crossings we're going to be able to, you know, that we wouldn't have any impacts to those structures.
So that's a fairly thorough answer to that question. Thank you very, very much. That's a lot. There's a lot to consider, and I'm intrigued too to learn more about how you integrate the Indigenous values in. But I see Suzanne's probably got another question.
Yeah, so Suzanne has a hand up, and we also have a question come in from Jody in the Q&A. So Suzanne, if you go first, and then I'll take a look at Jody's question. We'll go to that.
Okay,
Go ahead,
I
Susan.
wanted to pose a question that we got from via email. But before doing that, I wanted to just sort of let folks in the gallery know watershed assessments are a topic of conversation at the CAP meetings. This is not something we're not aware of, and we are having lots of conversations about that. So we don't always agree on where we're at the same time, but it's a moving conversation. So I wanted to raise this because I thought it was a good one. We got this email from ELF, and they were asking about opportunities to secure more red listed sword fern and salal and flat moss. And I know you kind of touched on this at some level, Lori, in your presentation of trying to figure out where like the subzones and BEC zones and zonal components, but could you speak to whether or not there are opportunities to capture missing red and blue listed ecosystem types?
Yeah, for sure, Suzanne. So, first of all, if we go into a block and find an ecosystem that's potentially endangered and it's sufficiently established, it doesn't get logged. So the Douglas fir flat moss or the cedar sword fern, in a young age, they're not at risk, right? They're not considered at risk no matter what the age. They're only considered at risk when they're in their climax or old forest condition, which people used to say, oh, that's 250 years. No, that's insufficient. It can totally be an endangered, good representation of that plant community much younger, right? So that's where we use this forest attribute score to look at that ecosystem and say, does it have the structures that even though it's 100 years old, it's sufficiently established? And so if it passes that forest attribute score, it becomes ecosystem at risk and it gets protected. But then also in the rest of the conservation network, we're trying to capture like at least 30% of those ecosystems. And if we do that and they get older, they won't be at risk here anymore. And we have on the richer sites like more than 30%. We might not have 30% of the zonal site type. I'm not convinced of that yet because of this 3 ecosystems in a terrestrial ecosystem polygon. Like the mapping of those polygons is just not very good here.
Just like
I'm not sure how we check that, but just one more thing, Anna, before you go. But this kind of assessment, like that shows, hey, we might be short in this zonal ecosystem. It lets us know then that when we go out and look, if we can find good zonal ecosystems that would fit in that conservation network, and we can find something else to take away that's not loaded with values, then we can make that swap, right? It's not likely I would want to swap a richer ecosystem for a zonal ecosystem, but maybe if that zonal ecosystem was in a good spot.
The TEM and sensitive ecosystem inventory is used as a tool and as a guide to help you figure out where you're at. However, TEM for this was done for a very specific purpose that was very broad. And it's also done at such a scale that when you're really looking at trying to find the red and blue, it's almost sneaky because it doesn't really tell you where it is. Whereas when you're mapping at a much finer scale, like this is at 1 to 20, at 1 to 8, that's when most ecologists will comment on whether or not an ecosystem you can find it, right? Or if it's expressed itself. So it's a great guide, but I don't lock in these numbers in my head, especially when we can go out and see them and find them in an area where it's, yeah, we've got a beautiful swath of sword fern. And we got all the bots and all the big snags and all the coarse woody debris. And we're like standing in something that's old forest or sufficiently established.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
So we have just a quick time check. We have 6 minutes to the hour. We have one more question coming from the public from Jody, who's listening in. And so she's saying, to what degree do you consider fungal values in site assessments, particularly exomycorrhizal fungi harvested for food? I think this question came up at the last CAP meeting, didn't it? Steve, did you raise this and you were talking a bit to this one? But Laura, do you want to go first?
I'd be happy to talk about it a little bit. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I don't want to step in if you have something to say.
Neither Anna or I are mycologists. We have, since the last CAP meeting, talked to some who will say like old forests are generally more diverse, and it might be possible to find some fungi that reflect more old forest conditions, but it's not a simple thing, and you probably need a microscope because fungi are associated with particular habitats and then weather conditions and also cirro stages, but not just cirro stages. So it gets to be pretty tricky to use them as indicator species. That being said, with local knowledge about where important sites are, we can incorporate those. And then edge effects, like having forest interior and having forest influence over the block, that should allow the ectomycorrhizal fungi that are so important in tree growth get out into those blocks to support the regenerating stems. So.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we started a few years ago, as local soil scientists doing general surveys, not looking at any specific fungi, but looking at the presence of fungi and bacteria in the soil. And if you think about the analogy of a wildlife camera monitoring, it's not really looking for anything in particular in terms of types of fungi. It's just what's the presence of fungi and bacteria in the soil over time during logging or in control areas where there was no logging. Just to kind of get a sense of what impacts on the soil are of different activities above the ground. So that's in pretty early stages right now. But we also have been on some walks with local mushroom pickers to gather their knowledge. And that's where, when we talk about community values coming into ecosystem-based management, you know, the ecologists, they have their work and they have their expertise, but the best people to assess where are the good mushroom picking spots on the Sunshine Coast are the people who are doing it. What kind of expert are you going to hire from Squamish or Vancouver to come and do that here and really do an effective job, right? That's kind of silly.
But we could get Andy McKinnon out. He's lots of fun.
Yeah, so we've been talking about trying to have some kind of committee, some kind of group, a place for people to come and you know, share things with us. Although no one wants to give up their mushroom picking spots, so that's it's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I feel a little guilty about just how many chanterelles we found this year. It was a very amazing year for chanterelle, and I think Steve, you mentioned this, and I think the question talks to the kind of potential over harvesting, and we just talked to the potential to expose areas where they're important for certain types of fungi, and obviously people then wanting to harvest and being protective of those spots. So there's a bit of a balance to be struck within that as well.
It can be the same thing with seeking input from First Nations. So often input from Shishel isn't something you're going to be able to share broadly with the public, right? They'll make comments on what we've missed, what should be included, without probably attributing why it's important.
Yeah, it's hugely important to have respect for that and for these ecologically important areas as well. Do we have any more questions, comments from the public or from the floor?
I do have a comment before we wrap up completely. One of the goals of today was to talk about the CAP and the purpose of the CAP and its makeup. And so, you know, this is kind of from our terms of reference that we originally came into, which is that the CAP is a group of interested and informed members of the public who offer recommendations and opinions that help inform community forest planning, policy, and actions. And as a diverse group with different backgrounds, it's hoped we hold some of the varied community values around the forest. Without a vested interest in the decisions of the community forest, we can offer our unvarnished and unbiased observations and do so quite frequently, advice and opinions. And these are then considered by the board, and we do have a mechanism for if they act contrary to the advice of the community advisory panel, there is an expectation that they report back and explain their decisions and explain why they decided to go against our recommendations. So this is, I think, an important conversation between the Community Forest Board of Management and representative members of the community, represented as, you know, I don't know how well we do it, but represented by the members of the Community Advisory Panel. The other part of our mandate is to try to develop strategies for further community engagement, of which tonight's webinar is one example. And because this came out of a desire to try to promote, you know, better engagement with members of the community. But I would like to just add to that, if you, all of the people in the gallery, if you find that you have a persistent interest in the community forests and what we're doing in the CAP, then we do have a process for admitting new members of the community into the CAP. If you don't think you're your particular point of concern or point of view is represented, then by all means, talk to the community forest, talk to Sarah, and we'll look for ways to bring you in. I do think personally that the CAP is heavily biased in favor of conservation-oriented people. We actually are all kind of environmentalists, and we all came in with like, okay, well, let's make sure that these guys are doing things. This ecosystem-based forestry management is what got everybody excited, rather than the forestry piece. And then, of course, we came in here, and I think my experience is probably no different from anybody else's. That we went, oh, wow, Lori really knows what she's talking about, doesn't she? Wow, Warren seems really informed. So there's a general, I think, feeling of one of the reasons we're excited about being part of this is because we do feel like this is an important opportunity, this ecosystem-based forestry management and adoption of that, and having a board that is on board with that and a management team that is on board with that, and presumably a stakeholder, Seashell municipality that is on board with that, that we have an opportunity to make an example that the other community forests in the province can learn from and follow. And so anyway, so that's just what I wanted to add to this conversation tonight. And again, encourage people, if you want to be more involved, talk to Sarah, I think, and we'll arrange for you to to join a couple of meetings and see what you think.
Right.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we were going to have a bit more of a session around what the community forest is and introduce people to that. I think maybe in a future one we might go a bit more into that, and hopefully people can join. There's lots of information online as well. Sarah, do you want to talk a little bit to that in the last closing minutes? And,
about the information that's online?
Yeah,
sure.
please.
Yeah, I would love to do that. There was actually also one question about some of the advertising that came in, which is relates to the information online. So there's a bit of a segue there to capture one more. So a lot of these ads that you've seen, 900% increase in old growth in the community forest. It's pretty exciting, right? I do communications here. I'm not an ecologist. And the figures that went into that came from the EBM plan that's on our website. And so there, I'll send out references to it after, because I know that some people really want those. But if you search the document, you'll find the number 452 as the number of hectares of old growth in the community forest. It's in a graph in that document, and there's also an appendix that refers to the source, which is the 2022 VRI. And it's based on the percent of old growth in the community forest as a whole. So there's a lot of nuance to that. What's in the, timber harvesting land base, or the forest managed land base, and and is the VRI accurate? And so some of that nuance we heard about tonight. This is a measure, so it's a number from a source that we use in landscape level planning, and it's just something to get really excited about. We inherited a tenure that has very little old growth in it, shockingly low old growth. And however you define old growth, and whether you're talking about old forest or old growth, or VRI 2022's old growth, or some other kind of, sure, we can haggle about what that is, but there's a bigger point here, which is that we're doing something really exciting because we live in a community that's passionate about their forests, passionate about forest conservation. And that empowers us to do forestry in a way that's bold and innovative. So that document, we have a website, sccf.ca/EBM. And from there, that leads you to the sort of more wildlife detail, more hydrology. You'll find it leads to the wetland restoration site work that we've done with Sunshine Coast Wildlife Project. All that kind of thing kind of branches out from that main EBM page. So it gives you a little bit of an introduction, and then you can find the things you want to dig into deeper, find a watershed assessment that you want to fact check something or what have you. Yeah, and if you're interested in joining the community advisory panel, you can send an email expressing interest to me. So that's sarah@sccf.ca, and I'll drop that in the chat as well.
Thanks, Sarah. So we're 5 minutes over time. Thank you, everybody, for staying up a little bit longer. Thanks to Laurie and Anna for the presentation and all the work you're doing on EVM, and the rest of the staff here, Warren, Sarah, for integrating all of that work and working with the community. And to the CAP members for their work. They are here as volunteers and give of their time freely. So it's be amazing contribution that we make as well. We'll wrap up there. If you have further questions, anyone within the CAP or beyond, or the people who have joined, I think we have 19 people joined online as well, which is great for our first one. Thank you all so much as well for joining, and I hope you found it really informative. Please let us know. I think there's a poll or a survey, Sarah, that we put up online there.
That was just to let us know how you found out about this. So.
Yeah, and yeah, we'll be reaching out as well to see how you found this session, and if we can do other things in future and improve this going forward to improve our communications with the public. Thanks so much. Anyone have any other closing words?
No, thank you, Richard.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye for now. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Bye.